Good morning and welcome to the Point. Over the past several days, you have heard a lot of talk about Syria. What should the United States do? What will the United States do? Throughout the week, we've been talking to a number of your elected representatives, and in just a few minutes, you'll hear from Congressman Fred Upton. He's the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee. He tells us what he thinks will happen in Washington over the next week or so, and why he doesn't believe the president will get what he wants. But first, a former Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, was speaking at the Ford Museum in Grand Rapids. We talked to him about his take on the Middle East. If this is an original rule of yours, it's one that's been widely disseminated. I'm going to read directly. Don't accept an inaccurate premise in a question. Rephrase it if necessary. You say sometimes reporters can be provocateurs. So let me ask a question that you may rephrase.
Improve also, probably.
Since 9/11, since the efforts of the Bush and subsequently the Obama administration in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the Middle East is still a very volatile place, from Egypt to Syria to Iran. Are we better off in the Middle East than we were prior to September 11th?
Are we better off? The Middle East is in turmoil. I was President Ronald Reagan's Middle East envoy, and I can remember sending back a cable saying, you'll never hear out of my mouth that we seek a just and lasting peace in the Middle East, because there isn't a lot of peace. There's a lot of turmoil, a lot of memory, historical memory that it creates hostility, and that I think the United States is probably not the best country in the world to be a peacekeeper in that part of the world. That smaller countries are less of a target, and that we can be helpful and we ought to be engaged. But you know, is Afghanistan a lot better off than it was under the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda there attacking our country? You bet Afghanistan's better off. Is Iraq better off? Absolutely it's better off. With Saddam Hussein gone, the butcher of Baghdad had killed hundreds of thousands of human beings. He'd used chemical weapons on his own people and on his neighbors. Is it stable? No. Are we at risk in important countries like Egypt and Iran? Absolutely. The people in Egypt today believe that the United States supported the Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood. And they can't imagine why, and I can't either. Iran is on the path of trying to develop a nuclear weapon. That could lead to proliferation in the region. Other countries are capable of having those weapons, and if Iran develops a weapon and has a weapon, given what they say about Israel, I can't imagine Israel not feeling it has to defend itself. I think it will defend itself. So it's a troubled part of the world. We're not likely to solve the problems because it's hundreds of years of hostility and differences. But we can contribute to make it a somewhat more stable and a somewhat more peaceful place.
While speaking to a group there at the museum, he made it clear what his thoughts were on Syria as well.
Well, I'm glad I don't have to give advice, to be honest with you. I think it's as I say, the steps that have been taken previously, I think, have been, in a number of instances, unfortunate. There's no question but that a lot of people in that part of the world today believe that we put our, I guess this shows how old I am, I was going to say we put our thumb on the scale like the old butcher used to do in Egypt and favored the Muslim Brotherhood. And the people who don't favor the radical Islamists have turned away from us because of that. And the situation he faces in Syria is not simple. There are people who believe very sincerely that we should be helping the rebels who are opposing Assad. I look at it and I see a spectrum of people. I see Al-Qaeda types and the radical Islamists on one part, Muslim Brotherhood types, who are well organized, dedicated, brutal, tough, and determined. and pretty well financed. And then you see a lot of nice people who have good intentions and would like better jobs and are tired of an Assad dictatorship and the brutality of it, who don't like the idea of using chemical weapons on their own people. And you wonder, if you help, what will be the outcome? Can you really help? Can you affect it? And I guess I'm kind of at a point where I think well, let me take a moment on this. And I was speaking at Leavenworth to, I think, 1,490 some odd majors from various countries, including ours, a lot from our country. And the last question was, what do you worry about the most? And you know, the things that pop in your mind, you think of cyber warfare and how dependent we are on digits as a people. The more advanced countries, obviously, are the most vulnerable countries to cyber attacks. We've thrown away our 3x5 card boxes, and and you think of terrorism, and you think of nuclear weapons, and actually what I answered was different. I said, what worries me the most is that throughout my adult life, the United States of America, following Great Britain, has contributed to a more stable and peaceful world. And that has been a force generally for good in the world. And that we are at a period where that is in decline. I don't think you can manage your economy modeling it on Europe and not send a signal out of weakness. That's a failed model. It doesn't work, and what we're doing isn't working. And the world knows it isn't working, and they expect us to be less capable, less involved. I talked about the defense budget, and I think took out $500 billion, and then over a 10-year period, and then agreed to take out under the sequestration another $500 billion, which sends out a signal to the world that the United States is not only going to be in decline from an economic standpoint, but is going to be in decline from a military standpoint. When I went to Washington out of the Navy in 1957, we were spending 10% of our gross domestic product on defense. Today we're spending less than 4% on defense. This was during the Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson period, 10% of GDP. The deficits are coming not from the defense budget, they're coming from entitlements. It's just, I mean, as Willie Sutton said, they said, why did you rob banks? And he said, well, that's where the money is. And people are saying, well, we ought to take it out of defense. And I don't know, our friends in Europe, the other like-thinking countries in the world, are spending less than 2% of GDP on defense. Now, what does that signal of weakness means? It means that we're creating a vacuum out in the world. And that vacuum is being filled by people who don't have our values, don't have our interests, and are behaving in ways fundamentally different than they would behave if they sense that the United States was going to continue to be a significant factor in the world for peace and for stability. Now, what does all that mean? It means to me, you go to Syria. Let's take it down to a specific case. You know, you begin by saying I would always tend to be favorable to a president's proposal in this area. The debate about whether or not the president has the authority to use force is silly. I mean, we've gone through, when was the last time war was declared? It was World War II. We've used force how many times? Why? Because the commander-in-chief, you can't have 535 members of Congress making decisions that a commander-in-chief needs to make. You just can't do it. It doesn't work. Now, what does all that mean? I have to say that the idea that the president would play cards or go to Las Vegas during Benghazi, or that he would go play golf during this decision with respect to Syria, having described it, having had his Secretary of State describe it, with the forcefulness and thoughtfulness, I will say, that Secretary Kerry presented to the country. I don't know how many people heard his remarks, but I thought they were compelling and persuasive. And the president is not, in my view, providing the kind of leadership that I think almost any president in my adult lifetime would be providing. I mean, I can say for a fact, I think of Gerald Ford and how he would be dealing with an issue like this, and it would be notably different. And I think that the essence of leadership is believability and having a vision, and the ambivalence about what it is we might do in Syria. I'm at the point where if someone walking down the street or in an elevator said, "What do you think?" I would say immediately, you either ought to change the regime or you ought to do nothing. Why would you go in and fire a shot across the bow? All it does is make a splash. What have you achieved? Well, what you've probably achieved, if you approach it from a minimalist standpoint, what you've probably achieved is the embarrassment of the United States for being feckless and ineffective.
The former defense secretary had his say at the Ford Museum, but it will be the members of the Senate and House that will have their say on the president's request in Washington in the coming week or so. When we come back, Congressman Fred Upton weighs in next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. Congressman Fred Upton talked to us earlier this week in his Kalamazoo office. We, of course, talked about Syria. He, like almost everyone, agrees Syria is a very, very volatile place, and what's going on there is troubling. But his take on what the United States will do, or at least what the United States Congress will do, may surprise you. This has been a remarkable year. You and I have had some serious conversations about some big issues, but nothing perhaps bigger than the one that we'll talk about right now, and it's Syria. Earlier in this program, former Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld, speaking at the Ford Museum, said that he really didn't think going to Syria made a lot of difference unless you went for regime change. That is, if I understand it, not the plan that will be on the table when you head back to Washington.
Well, that's right. And though I missed Don being there, if you really look at regime change, then you're looking at a huge impact in terms of influence. I mean, you got to have boots on the ground. You got a court system. You got infrastructure. You got Iraq big time all over again. And so, as much as people don't like Assad, I mean, you're talking about a major investment of dollars, blood, coalition, and who knows where it leads, particularly with Russia and Iran, and what happens with Israel. I mean, it's nobody's really calling for that, just because they know where. If you go to first base, you got to go to second and third, and how many years, and can it really even happen, as some said, in this century? Probably not.
So the question then before the body, as it will be, presuming that the House moves it on to the floor, will be a limited time frame, limited engagement, no boots on the ground type of event that would be aimed, if I understand the administration's role, in somehow mitigating the ability of the Syrian government to deliver more chemical weapons. Tell me, from your perspective, as somebody who has been in that house for a good long while, how is this playing? What are your colleagues feeling and thinking? What are your constituents telling you?
Well, I can tell you what my constituents are saying. That's real easy. No. Our phones have been swamped. It's, a lot of calls. I mean, sometimes I'll call, what are people saying at home? And it'll be like 5 calls. No, we're in the thousands. My guess is we're going to be at least 80 to 90% against what the president's calling for. And I got to take back, I've been in Congress a few years, so we've had votes on this, and I certainly owe it to the nation and my constituents to get as much information as I can gather. And I think it's important for me to go to the classified briefing, which I'm scheduled to do next Monday when I'm back in D.C. But as people look at this issue, there is real concern about where it leads. this latest chemical attack was probably not the first one. So even though the president laid down the line, here's my red line, do this, that was months ago, and it happened. It happened not once, not twice, but maybe as many as three times. It is a civil war. More than 100,000 innocents have been killed. Is this where the U.S. should go next, knowing that we are a war-weary nation? Afghanistan, more than 10 years. Iraq, I mean, all those different things that we've been into. My constituents are pretty clear this is not where we want to go. We'll see what the Senate does next week. Most pundits think that the Senate will probably pass it on Wednesday. The House is a whole different story. And even though Boehner and Cantor, our two leaders of the House Republicans, have come out in support of it, they've made it pretty clear that this really is a vote of conscience, that we are each going to assemble our own information, decide what to do. And I think it will be very tough for this administration to pass the same type of resolution in the House as they are likely to pass come next Wednesday in the Senate.
What does that say to the public at large? What does it say to the administration? But most important, what does it say to our allies and our enemies around the globe if, as you predict, you have a hard time getting it through the House and the president is denied his request for military activity, which would be the first time that has happened in modern history?
Well, you got to remember, the stage is a little different pattern than what happened before. I was one of maybe a handful of Republicans that went to President Bush 41 back in the early 90s on Iraq. He didn't want to go to the Congress. He thought he had all the rights. He felt, he had the background. And a number of us convinced him that, in fact, he had to sell it to the American public and to the Congress. And he did. He set up the specific goals. Remember, Kuwait had been invaded. He built a strong coalition. They did it right. It was short. It was funded by the Saudis and others in terms of a whole lot of costs. Yes, it was our planning, of course, and our expertise got it done. But we were gone, and we were out of there quickly.
And it was very limited in scope because he didn't go to Baghdad.
It was, and he got criticized later for not doing so. But that was not part of the game plan as he sold it, and he played by the rules, something that George Bush always did. Now you've got the UN. The UN has already said earlier this week, don't do this. You don't have a UN mandate to do it. Please don't. The UK, the Brits, have already said no. Germany has already said no. The Poles have already said no. Only the French are there, really. And so this is you've not built a coalition. You've not built the support of the American public. You've certainly not built any bipartisan coalition in the House or Senate. And the president is prepared to go forward maybe anyway without really laying the groundwork for preparing, not a speech really to the American public from the Oval Office or anything like that. And he's not there to push this, and it's very troubling. And that's what my constituents from across the board, all across our district, I'm asking, what's going on here? You can't possibly do this. We're not prepared to do this. And where does it go? Nobody knows those answers. Maybe they tell them in the classified briefing. I'll find out when I'm there next Monday.
One of the issues that concerns many people that I have spoken to, you've talked to a lot more people, but one of the things that worries some folks is that we don't know what Russia is thinking. They've made quite a bit of noise.
How about Iran?
Well,
they're a lot closer to this.
Although Russia does have assets in the region, they've made it very clear that they do.
And one of the things that became public last spring was that Iran was actually shipping stuff through, guess where? Iraq. Malachi, the guy that we've spent trillions, hundreds of billions of dollars on, they were actually a conduit for arms from Iran to Assad, going through the very country that we saved. That's how bad things are. And what a mess they are. And of course, you have to worry about Israel. I'm a strong supporter of Israel. But you just, where does this take us? And I don't know that anybody has gamed that out.
And if you got into a situation where there was some type of a provocation between us and Russia, or Russia and us, that could expand this thing in a big way, in a big hurry.
Yeah, that's right. And this is, you'll smile. It's another reason for the Keystone Pipeline, energy independence, so that we don't have to rely on our friends in the Middle East. This is something where we ought to be it's been 1,800 days. It makes all the sense in the world so that we don't have to have this umbilical cord to that region. And you know, who knows what's going to happen with gas prices if this thing escalates in a way that nobody can control.
The serious impact of what does or does not happen in Syria and what happens in the larger area of the Middle East, obviously, is the most important. But I can't help but ask you about the political importance here in the United States. Let's just pretend for a moment that the House of Representatives doesn't come up with the votes to pass what the president wants. The president at that point either abides by the vote or he doesn't. There's been conversation both ways, and I won't prejudge what he may or may not do. But what does that do then to the political conversation that we've already discussed that you have to have when you go back? You have to talk about a debt ceiling. You have to talk about budget. You have to talk about spending levels. You have all of that that's on your plate and some pretty close deadlines. This coming just before it has the potential politically, it would appear, to make things more difficult.
Well, it does, and it underscores, you know, it's not a secret that this administration has had pretty lousy relations with the Congress. And I hear that from Democrats, certainly on the Republican side. You know, Ronald Reagan, a guy that I work for, Democratic Congress, he had a lot of victories because he reached out. He had really good relations with, from Tip O'Neill on down. This president doesn't have that. There's been no outreach, there's no contacts, and you know, as they look at probably the most decisive thing perhaps in this second term of his presidency, and maybe that'll establish the legacy of his presidency, he's not done the homework, the groundwork to really foster the relations, earning the trust on an issue like this. Now, as we said at the beginning, Boehner and Cantor on board, they almost have to be based on the leadership position that they have. And of course, they do have somewhat of a relation with the president. But nobody else does. And that's why this really is a vote of conscience. Is this the best thing for the country or not? What does it lead to, knowing that we're putting the lives of our troops, men and women, but also our taxpayers? This is not going to be a cheap thing. We're trying to recover from an awful recession. For us here in Michigan, 38 consecutive months of double-digit unemployment, and you know, we're beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel. It's not the train coming the other way. Something like this, all of a sudden, as we've seen with the topic and the debate, no matter where you go, it's this, it's nothing else, and it's pushed all these other pretty important issues, whether it's the end of the fiscal year, we're getting ready for the next one, the debt ceiling, immigration, Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, all of those things are now, you know, behind the curtain, not out front, with not a lot of legislative days between now and Christmas.
As he pointed out, Congressman Upton will get that classified briefing tomorrow. We'll see then if that changes his mind in terms of what happens next in Syria. We're back with more To the Point in just a moment. In this coming week, we will get a better idea about how Congress will react to the president's request to take military action in Syria, but it may not all happen this week. There is a possibility that the Senate will vote, likely pass, the president's resolution. But when it gets over to the House, it may take a little bit longer, and as you heard earlier in our show, at least one member doesn't believe the votes will be there. We'll continue to follow that and keep you updated. We hope you'll join us next Sunday morning, 10 o'clock on Wood TV 8 for To the Point.